Hello?
Is that Mr. DeMayo?
Depends who's asking.
I'm just renaming you, so I want to make sure that it's correct.
Why? What did it come up as? Did it come up as Darcy?
No, it comes up as your phone number.
Oh yeah, this is me. I'm in the car, so.
Well, it's
driving,
1:02, and we'll adjourn our meeting.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna go on mute and so that there's no feedback. So, but I'm here.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So would anyone like to look at the meeting minutes from our last meeting, which was so long ago?
I think we just need to make sure that on camera we call the meeting to order at 1:02 p.m. You may want to do that to start.
So yes, 1:02 p.m. We'd like to call the meeting of the policy subcommittee to order. Thank you, Dr. Byers. And so the first item on the agenda would be to approve the minutes. So let's look at the meeting minutes from back in February of our last meeting. For those who were there.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Who made that motion?
Mr. Davis.
Thank you.
And how do we do the vote? Do we just do the roll call or do we do?
I will call the roll on screen, especially because we can't see Mr. DeMayo's face to begin with. So Ms. Eichler, that's a yes. Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Howard?
Yes.
And Mr. DeMayo?
Yes.
Okay, so those are approved.
Thank you. Now, our next items are the policies for consideration. So could we look at the third item, the policy for armed school security officers on page 4?
And so, Ms. Perro, can you share your screen and show the two, or start with the North Branford policy, please?
Never done this before, so bear with me. There we go. Can you see the word coming up? Is it working?
No.
Can you see that?
We see your browser window,
Right.
your
Like your file window.
your file window.
All right, I might have a way around this, but give me a second to figure it out.
I will come into you if you can help me.
No, stay there. Give me a second here. Let's see.
Is it appropriate to point out that our packet is available on the board website?
Yes, it is, but I think it will be easier for us to have a
There you go.
conversation if we're all looking at the same thing. So if you can just give me a minute here. That's not going to do it. Let's see. All right. Okay. So I open this. Okay, and I'm gonna make this a little smaller, a little easier to read. All right. Okay, and then let me go back into Zoom. All right, Pam, can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Figure this out. Let me see. Stop share. Okay.
There you
Done.
go.
That I can do.
Now, I will share at least the board packet. So, all right.
There it is.
So, so Ms. Perro, you'll have to just edit your own documents as we're going through this. We won't be able to see the edits, but at least we can see the things that we're all looking at.
Sure.
So with the approval last year, I guess it was in the winter, by the board for the concept of school security officers in our buildings as part of our safety program. we needed to look at a policy to put in place for those. And so I first contacted CABE and looked at their model policy manual, and they do not have a policy for school security officers. I then contacted our board's attorney, and they also do not have a model policy for school security officers. So what I did end up doing was getting two policies that have been adopted by other boards of education previously. Those from North Branford and those from Newtown. I believe that you would see in those two policies that there is some overlapping and similar language. And so really I'm putting this before the board for consideration of using either one of these policies as our model policy, or to potentially either combine them or to edit one of these policies. It's my preference that I believe I like the North Branford policy a little bit better, only in the sense that I think it has a little bit more of designating kind of the role and sort of the vision for that SSO in a way that the Newtown policy does not. But frankly, I think that the meat of the language in both of them is so similar that it really, if the policy committee felt strongly about the Newtown policy, we would be perfectly fine with that as well. So, so anyway, so obviously Ms. Pero would edit these with the appropriate changes for the Amity School District, but she needs to know which one to start with. And since this is brand new and we don't have a policy from our typical sources to consider, that's why I have both of these up for your thoughts.
Do you think?
Oh, go ahead, Ms. Eigler.
Oh, I like the North Branford one as well. Could we add the 4th paragraph starting with an armed school security officer or something to that effect to the North Branford policy? Because I really like how specific they are about use of the weapon.
Yep, absolutely. I think it would go actually as the 4th paragraph.
Okay.
Can I just ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I know that normally we have to do a first read and a second read. And so maybe I wasn't privy to this information, or you guys discussed it prior to or not, but what does it look like for us? I'm assuming that this is going to happen September or even August when school starts. Will we have these people in place, or we don't? Or what's the timeline looking like to get this through first and second read and then it approved? So am I asking the right question? I'm not sure if I'm asking it the right way or not, but what's the timeline to put these people in place, and what do we need from a policy and from a board standpoint to, and if it was set in the packet and I didn't read it, then,
Well, it wouldn't
you
be
could just say,
to put that in the packet, but what it looks like in terms of a timeline is if there's an approval today to sort of give us some direction for how we're going to amend this. So something like to adopt the North Branford policy with the addition of the 4th paragraph from Newtown, and then to make this all into Amity language, we would bring it to the board for a first read in August. And then it would go to the board for a second read in September. Meanwhile, we are in the process of posting for those positions. We're controlled somewhat by that, by the deadline for the training that has to be provided to those individuals. So those individuals would have to be hired before the policy is actually, it would have gone through first read, but not through second read before that they would have to be hired, because we have to have them on board in time for an August 17th and 18th training, and that's set by the state police department.
So, not mentioning any names, but if I were opposed to having armed security guards in Amity, is there a way that I could potentially delay this from an Amity board standpoint if I were a board member who was opposed to this? I'm not mentioning any names, just thinking. Go ahead.
You can delay the policy. At that point, we would probably, so the personnel are hired, they're at-will employees, so we would, you know, be responsible to a certain extent for giving them appropriate notice. And but because they're at-will employees, if they for some reason had to be let go or weren't going to be the armed school security officers, then we would have to address it then. But we're really, you know, unfortunately, and again, it's one of those things because of COVID, we're in a time crunch to meet the deadline of the police academy training at the same time as trying to put the policy in place.
Yep. Okay.
So yes,
I just wanted to make sure.
If the policy,
Do you know what I'm saying without saying it?
Yeah, if the policy didn't pass the board, then we would absolutely have, it would be an HR matter that we would have to do to sort of extricate ourselves from the agreement that we have with hiring that individual.
Okay. All right.
So I guess to piggyback on that, we'll get to that when we make the motion about this policy, but it would be to go to the Board of Ed regular meeting, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
A question. First of all, I was on exactly the same page on the proposal, including the North Branford policy and the fourth paragraph of the Newtown policy. Do we have a position called the lead school security officer?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
But it hasn't been filled yet. So it's going to have to draw from the individuals who first applied for the SSO to identify who the LSSO is. But we do have that planned.
All right. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't putting something in there that we didn't have. Is there any specific mention, I couldn't find it, of a specific type of training that should be in the policy that these officers have had?
So it's really in that the bottom of that third paragraph,
right?
Where the specific qualifications are set, are amended from time to time at the discretion of the board, consistent with state and federal law. It really goes back to the state laws, because I looked for that, and it was when I was poking around in the police academy training site that they referenced the statutes that are listed in the Newtown policy that aren't listed in the North Branford policy that direct what the training and the qualifications would be. More likely that specific amount of information would be spelled out in the regulations. That's where we saw that for the other districts, because those can get amended.
Okay.
So while you're there where the specific qualifications is, could we look at that wording at the end, at the discretion of the board instead of in the discretion of the board?
Yep.
I had initially a question simply about the series that they put it in. They put it in series 2000 for personnel, but in our policy manual, that's series 4000. Just want to point that.
Yeah, we're aware, George, of the series issues because we're not quite sure where it's going to land. The Newtown policy is actually the same number as the Amity SRO policy. So I can't use the Newtown number. And you're right, the North Branford policy put it in personnel, which would be our 4000 series. So once we have this sort of flushed out, Ms. Pero will contact CABE to identify sort of the most appropriate numerical residency for this policy, because we sort of struggled with a back and forth on that, trying to figure out which one it was appropriate to be at.
And I'm assuming that North Branford has more than one superintendent. In the first paragraph, they say superintendents. So if we could just make that singular.
And I'm certain that they do not have more than one. So.
Okay. Those were my only suggestions for that.
All right.
And it sounds like Mr. Davis and Ms. Eichler would like that in the language from the fourth paragraph from the Newtown policy.
Yeah, the only, we may have to do something a little funny, just by the way, on that, throughout all of this, but I'm looking particularly at that fourth paragraph with that whole understanding or agreement with the town of Newtown, because we'll have to specify probably something connected to BOE, but.
Thank you. That is something I had marked as well. So would somebody like to make a motion?
I'll make the motion to move this policy to first read. Is that what the motion should be?
But I think you have to add that one paragraph that you wanted to add,
Okay.
I believe.
I'll make the motion to add, to move this policy to first read with the addition of the fourth paragraph from the Newtown policy and then all other changes that need to be made. Does that sound right?
I'll second that. That's Steve. Steve will second it.
We don't need a second.
You don't need a second.
All right, so calling the roll, Ms. Eichler,
Yes.
Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
and Mr. DeMayo. Oh, did we lose Mr. DeMayo?
I think we might have lost him.
We did.
Uh-oh.
Okay. All right, let it be noted that he left at
118.
1:18 and likely will join us again, so.
Happens. So could we then turn please to the next policy on page 7 of the packet?
All right. Okay, Title IX recently went through a fairly significant overhaul, and about 2,000 pages of it. And so the board's attorneys spent, I would say, the better part of the months of June and July going through all 2,000 pages. And they have made some recommended model policies that they believe are aligned to the new regulations. Title IX revisions are so extensive that that one sort of change in this policy is actually creating more changes into other policies. So what you have is kind of a first go round of the policies that are impacted by this. It would be my recommendation that as we go through all of these, that because they were prepared by the board's attorneys and they are aligned to the federal regulations, that you give some serious consideration to adopting them as they are written. We can certainly make any changes if you have seen typos or if the language isn't the way that you would like it reflected, but that would be my recommendation. The other nice thing that they've done is that they have graciously already prepared all of the regulations and the forms that we are going to be required to use to meet the policies. And in part, Mr. Brandt is here because you'll notice there are a couple of places where we have to designate different Title IX people, and we're still working that out. But it is more than likely that Mr. Brandt will be our Title IX coordinator for the district. And so he's here to, I guess, lend some weight to the idea that the policies are adopted as amended by our attorneys as well.
Okay, so about that, on page 8 where it says insert title, would that then be Director of Pupil and Personnel Services?
That would be correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. And then the only other thing to point out perhaps is the first policy number 5145.5 is an existing policy that we have, right?
Say that again, Mr. Howard?
Of those three policy numbers on page 7, the policy 5145.5 is an existing policy?
Yes, that's correct. So we would be completely replacing the current 5145.5 because it is so out of date with the new regulations.
Yes, thank you. And the other two are brand new policy numbers that we'll share.
So those are where they could also be cross-referenced, which we likely will do because this applies not only to students, but to personnel as well.
Yes.
So yes, they would be added there.
Very good, thank you.
Are we also talking about the policies that are on items 5 and 6, or right now is it just the 3 that are listed on item 4?
Right now, it's just item 4. And so you would just approve it sort of as one policy, even though it has the 3 numbers, because that's just sort of the 3 places it can get located in the policy manual.
Okay.
And obviously the 4118.112, we'll pick one of those 2 4000s. We don't duplicate it.
Okay.
Very good.
So,
yeah.
Go ahead, George.
No, go ahead, Ms. Ike.
Do we just want to make a motion to approve this?
Would you like to make that motion?
I'll make the motion to move.
And
I
we'll
guess.
take the vote.
Say it, George. What?
Oh, and we'll take a vote.
Okay.
And so, Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Eichler,
Yes.
and Mr. DeMeo.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So now, as Carla was saying, we'll turn to page 13 to look at the next piece of the policy.
So again, it's the same sort of circumstance that we have, that the attorney recommended that we update this to reflect the most current Title IX legislation. Sorry, let me scroll down to this policy here. All right, and so again, the definitions and everything is all coming from the revision to Title IX, and truthfully, it's the portion of Title IX that was changed most significantly was connected to the area of sexual harassment, and so that's why this one ended up requiring some of the revisions that it does. Again, this has been fully vetted by the board's attorneys, and it would be my recommendation that, other than some typos, if you see them, that we don't make any change to the substantial language that's within this policy.
So the only, it's not significant, just on page 17 under the cited policies already in the manual, 5145.5 is actually prohibition against sexual harassment. So maybe just to add the prohibition against.
Yes, because we're updating that policy now. So it would reflect, yes, our newest title of that policy.
Yeah.
Correct.
Thank you.
And that would be our position on that, that we would like to prohibit it. So absolutely right, Mr. Howard.
I will make that motion then.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
And we'll have a vote.
All right, Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Eichler,
Yes.
and Mr. DeMeo.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, let's see. Okay, so our next policy is a significant revision of the non-discrimination addressing transgender and gender non-conforming students. On this one, you'll see that there's quite a bit of language that has been changed and added to this policy. And again, it's reflective of sort of the updates that have been made to Title IX, and making sure that it is clear that these students are now part of a protected class, and that, that we are in compliance with the requirements that are related to those students who are transgender or gender nonconforming. Again, reviewed by the attorneys, and these are the recommendations that they have made.
Also, I have a question. When I looked in the policy manual, it looked like the regulation says typed 10/18/2012, but the policy is new, correct? This is a new.
Yes, so there's some challenges with our policy manual, Mr. Howard, that we've often found where regulations have been listed but not the actual policy. So it is entirely possible that this policy did at one point exist, but what we will do is we would put this policy in and then take those regulations out to make sure that they are updated and reflective of the policy.
I just wanted to be sure, because the cover, for the agenda, that this is a policy. It kind of uses words about regulation further down in the first and second paragraph. So I just wanted to clarify. So do we have a motion about this policy?
I'll make the motion.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Ms. Eichler?
Yes.
And Mr. DeMayo?
Yes.
All right. Then we are moving on to 5145.42, which is the 504. And Title II revisions.
Right.
And so then I think what started to happen is as our attorneys started to go through all the policies that were possibly impacted by the Title IX revisions, she started to find other policies that she recommended that we update or add to. So I think this is the first of an actually rather long list of policies that she's going to be amending for us. These were the ones that were most critical to start the school year. But I do think that this was one of them that she identified that we needed to have, I believe, in place. Because I believe this is one of the policies that is currently missing from our policy manual. I could be wrong about that, but I think this, in looking at it, I think this one looks like a new policy.
I do believe we approved it back August 12th, 2019.
Okay.
At least when I looked, that's I usually try to check before the meeting.
Got it.
So given that that's so mission critical, would anyone like to make a motion?
I'll make the motion.
Mr. Davis?
Mr. Davis?
Yep.
Okay, so Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Ms. Eichler?
Yes.
And Mr. DeMayo?
Yes.
Excellent. And then finally, the last in this round that Attorney Dugas revised for us was just our non-discrimination policy. Again, updating it to reflect additional information with respect to Title IX and to also make sure that the language was changed to be compliant with Title IX. Again, reviewed by the attorneys and recommendations made in accordance with those new revisions.
So the only question I have about the wording is, should it be, again, pupil personnel services, or can it just say pupil services?
We have pupil services on
Yeah, we can. It's fine as Director of Pupil Services.
Okay.
pupil personnel, whatever Tom's title is.
Does anybody have see anything?
Nope, I'm good.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Ms. Eichler. So calling the roll, Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Eichler,
Yes.
and Mr. DeMayo.
Yes.
I had just one question. Like in looking on the policy manual, I didn't see this policy, but I had to believe it was there. I saw 5145.42, section 504, but you know what I'm trying to say? I didn't see a 4.45.
And it would be a new policy.
Okay.
So again, you know, the board's attorneys did some very broad sweeping, these are the things you need to edit. And we know that we have several more that we have to look into that go back into the student area, but these are the ones that she recommended we address and edit first prior to the start of the school year.
Excellent. Thank you. So on to page 26, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. This would be a new policy for the board, and it was one that you'll see that CABE put out back in the springtime. And me being the hopeful person, hoped that we would never need this policy, and so we didn't really bring it forward at all. But I think as we look at where we are headed for this current school year, it is something that I'm at least putting forward to the board for consideration, which is the ability to let the superintendent suspend policy during a pandemic. And really it's sort of like the same concept of executive orders, I guess, is that depending how a situation changes and sort of the fluidity of it, it serves to some extent to protect the board for you to be able to say to people, no, we didn't follow our policies because we were in a pandemic, and yes, we had a policy that said it was okay to do this. You know, I can think of plenty of policies that around attendance, chronic absenteeism, grading, graduation requirements, the number of online credits you're supposed to take, the number of days you're supposed to actually be in school, our medical requirements in terms of immunization records. All of these things have been changed at the state level, or we've been told to suspend them or to give consideration for flexibility in those areas. And I imagine we will have more. And so, and given the speed at which this changes, I don't think changing every one of those individual policies is the most practical or effective way to do that. Plus, once the pandemic's done, you would then need to change them all back to what they were originally. I think just having that ability to allow us to suspend or waive them or make adjustments is probably the most flexible manner in which to act. But again, I put it before the board for consideration. And it was something that CABE had put out very early on in the pandemic. But like I said, I was hoping we wouldn't get to this point, but I think we have.
So thinking optimistically, once we are finished with COVID, would then this policy be retracted?
Yes. Yeah, there's two ways we could probably do it. You could either put this policy in and potentially put like a timeline on it. And then if you cross the timeline, you have to bring it up for consideration, almost like you would with an MOA, or you just put it in place and we flag it. And once we're out of the pandemic, the policy committee, recommends to the board that we discontinue policy 6114.81.
Just for clarification purposes, because I see some mixture here in establishing a policy to respond to a pandemic, and specifically the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yep.
What we're looking to do here is establish a policy just in relationship to COVID-19 and not pandemics in general.
Yes, I think that actually limits this policy a little bit more. And I think that would be more appropriate.
Starting from one question here. The third paragraph, it mentions the World Health Organization on March 11th. As of now, it appears that the United States is withdrawing from the World Health Organization, which means that a statement like that would be relatively meaningless. And it specifically, of course, mentions Governor Lamont.
As well as I think I would take that all out.
Right.
That would be my recommendation, as well as to delete that portion of the policy.
Right.
Are you talking the whole paragraph, Dr. Byers?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Good.
Because the other thing too is, in some ways, it seems to imply that we have to be in a state of emergency to do this, which we may not be, but we may still be operating under some peculiar circumstances in schools that would require some flexibility in policy.
So I have a funny question about regulation. There's no regulation behind this, or is there like a twin regulation behind it?
There's no regulation behind this that I know of that came from CABE.
Thank you. And I guess a related question is, any policies that get suspended, the regulations that are behind those policies would not be suspended, or how does that work?
No, they would be, because the policy trumps regulation.
Policy trumps regulation. Thank you.
So if this policy, if this doesn't become a policy, how does that, I mean, some of these things that are listed here, including like entering contracts without board approval and closing school facilities. I mean, those things have happened or will happen in the future with or without this policy. So without the policy, how does it affect the district?
So in that case, people, I guess they could come back and say you didn't follow policy when you did X. So like an example, and this one's a little bit more real, but we have a policy in place right now about the number of classes a student can take online for credit. So we fully intend at some point to probably have to waive that, because we have to allow parents the opportunity for remote learning and allow them to have courses that are only online for credit. So we have an entity, the Department of Education, saying do this. Our policy says something different. We're still going to end up doing that, but then somebody somewhere later could say, well, you shouldn't have given that kid a diploma because your policy said they could only have 3 online classes and you gave them 7 and awarded credit for all 7.
Mm-hmm.
So this would sort of add a layer of, I guess, protection, that if we do something that's sort of contrary to the current policy, but because it's fitting in other recommendations or other best practice, that way we can say, well, there was a pandemic going on and we had some suspension of policy during that time.
That makes sense.
And truthfully, it provides a layer of protection for me as your superintendent to be able to do that. I'll be very frank.
Right, right.
When it's time, like, let's just say the pandemic is officially over, the process for eliminating the policy or revising the policy is that the chair of the board then adds it to the policy agenda?
No, you would add it as the policy committee that it was just time to repeal that policy. And it obviously doesn't have to go through first reads or anything like that. It would just be a discussion and action by the board.
Okay, thank you.
Quick question though, who determines when the pandemic is done? Is it Governor Lamont? Is it the president? I mean, who determines when this pandemic is quote unquote over, and then our policy would follow that?
I imagine that for our operation, it would be the point when the Department of Public Health and the State Department of Education sort of say, yeah, we're set and we can resume operations as close to normal as possible. And I think it's probably even more clear with Mr. Davis's suggestion that we remove that 3rd paragraph, because it really then just kind of connects the board to the Connecticut State Department of Education.
Right.
And ultimately, they are the governing entity for schools.
So then would it make sense to just put an expiration date on this for like June 30th of next year? And then if we need to have it again for the following school year, we can do that?
I think you could probably do that.
I'd like to say it'd be done before June 30th of next year, but.
So we can make a sort of amendment somewhere at the end that would just say that this policy is established for the 2021 school year and would expire on June 30th, 2021.
Mhm.
Dr. Byers, you want that to be the last sentence?
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate.
Would you repeat that again, please? I'm sorry.
And that this policy would be in effect for the 2021 school year and would expire and be removed from the board's policy manual on June 30th, 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Eichler. Thank you, Dr. Byers. That's helpful.
One more question, if you don't mind. This relates to the number 3, the authority to enter into contracts without board approval for any dollar amount. I have no problem with the contract part of that, but the dollar amount, any dollar amount, doesn't limit us to what we have available to us.
So we can certainly amend that. So any dollar amount within the appropriated budget.
Yes, that sounds good.
There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
So the other thing I'm thinking of, I'm just thinking ahead to what the full board would say in terms of how this might affect the board's say in certain decision-making and contracts and purchasing and things like that. I I understand how it could protect us, but I also can see how others may feel like it takes some say away from the board.
So we already have provisions within the AFC policy itself that allows us for kind of emergency purchases that happen without approval. And so I actually see item 3 and 7 kind of partnering a little bit with that provision within the AFC. So if for some reason we had to purchase something and it was needed immediately and it was an emergency, I don't remember it exactly because I pulled out the policy, but like I have to notify the AFC chair and get kind of like a verbal confirmation. I have to notify the board chair and get a verbal confirmation, and then we get to go do that thing, and then we have to bring it back through AFC and the board afterwards. So this, I think, just sort of reinforces the existing AFC, and we could certainly look just to make sure that that's not contradictory language between items 3 and 7 and what is in the AFC policy. So does that help, Ms. Eichler?
I think so.
So also perhaps then on that page, is it 33 that lists those policies, that we could reference those AFC policies there?
Yep. Yeah, there's just one policy for the AFC, so we can cross-reference it to that.
Thank you.
I think it's actually a bylaw, but yep.
So do we have a motion?
May I, before you vote, unfortunately, my battery died quickly and I was out for just a moment or two at the very beginning. So I just want to summarize the changes to be sure I did not miss anything. Would that be all right? I have the third paragraph, World Health Organizations coming out. I have the number 3, we're adding within the appropriated budget after dollar amount. And then, of course, we're adding the last sentence: this policy would be in effect for the 2021 school year and would expire and be removed from the board's policy manual on June 30th, 2021. There's a highlighted portion on that last page, modify as feasible for your district. Did you address that, or is there something that I need to do with that section?
I think you can just delete that.
Okay.
How would this policy, I'm sorry for more questions, but how would this policy affect like other changes that could be made in terms of like grading policy, assessment? You mentioned the graduation requirements, but I'm wondering about how things are weighted, you know, any kind of changes like that. Would that also?
I mean, it's very broad in that it does allow us to make changes when necessary to essentially any policy. So yes, it's loose like that, but then I think at the same time, the intent is because we don't quite know what is going to happen. It doesn't put a limitation on those things. So yes, those could occur. And I think what is, I think it was in here. I mean, I suppose to some extent there it is. So the reporting to the board as feasible, appropriate, and timely regarding the emergency closure. So that consultation with the board is just kind of the provision that would allow me to inform you of changes to policy that are necessary because of the pandemic. Which frankly, again, we'll keep up with as best we can, but there are some things that are just moving rather rapidly.
There were, correct me if I'm wrong, changes to the grading policy back in the spring. So this kind of tidies that up. Like,
Yes.
yes.
And those were necessary, again, because we lost huge chunks of time in sort of some quarters and not in others. And
lots of
you're right.
things coming your way all at once.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ms. Pirro, for pointing out all the changes.
And I apologize for my battery dying.
Would someone like to make a motion on this policy?
Well, we could sit here all day, so I'll move it.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I'll call the roll. Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
I'll do Mrs. Eichler.
I'll say yes to move it to first read.
Okay, and Mr. DeMayo.
Yes.
Thank you.
So now the last policy, I believe, is an existing policy.
Yes, it is. And so this one I actually was able to pull. It wasn't so drastically different that I was able to include the existing policy from 2007 with the new policy that we are recommending for consideration. And I can certainly have Mr. Brandt chime in on this one, but requirements for homebound and hospital instruction did change in the recent years, and this policy was just never updated, but both he and I felt that given the circumstances, we probably needed to bring our policy a little bit more in line with the expectations that we have, sensing that there may be some additional requests for this in the upcoming school year. So Mr. Brandt, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to add?
No, just besides the point that Dr. Byers made that the laws and regulations did change several years ago. So we are actually following the new changes and not our stated board policy in terms of the number of days and the procedures and the paperwork being completed. So this policy just really brings us in line with what we're currently doing, which matches the state regulations.
So, quick question. So potentially we've been out of policy in a sense, or we've not been following our own policy for a couple of years now? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, in the sense that I think the policy that was in place was so broad. It wasn't so much that we weren't following it. It didn't have the restrictions on it that we actually really sort of need it to have at this point. Because yeah, there weren't any restrictions within the policy in terms of the alignment with the IEP and yeah, everything else that's in the new one.
So just to clarify, I think this is related. The existing policy is on page 31 and 32. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And the new proposed, which again comes from CABE actually, is the policy on page 33.
Because they both have legal references, I guess I was wondering if one was just replacing or if it's going to be kind of collated.
No, it's the new one from CABE would replace our existing policy. Yep. But I just kind of wanted the board to see sort of where, like, how much of a shift we had to make.
Yes.
So in the new policy, it mentions the PPT and the goals and objectives in the child's IEP. But what about if the student is on homebounds without an IEP? Is this assuming that, I'm just thinking about, you know, a kid who just suddenly gets sick and is out but doesn't have any services. Does that also cover them, or is this just for special education students?
No, this policy would cover any students who miss 10 consecutive school days, when then the provision of homebound instruction would start on that 11th school day, regardless of
But-
disability or non-disability.
Okay.
Question on the language. I noticed a change from residents of Bethany Orange and Woodbridge to students. Are we still obligated to supply instruction to students who are not students at the Amity district, even though they may be going to a private school, but now they would come under our instructional policy?
So in other words, they're a resident of BOE, but
Right.
they're not a enrolled student, and are we required to provide their homebound instruction? Mr. Brandt?
If they were, if they then enroll in one of our schools, we would then be responsible for providing their homebound instruction.
Okay.
So if they're privately attending a school, require homebound instruction, they would, if their private school does not provide it, they would have to enroll in one of our public schools, and then we would provide the homebound instruction.
At which point they would become students. Okay,
Yes.
that's sounds fine.
So in the first paragraph, could we put PPT in parentheses after planning and placement team?
Sure.
Sure.
Last sentence of the first paragraph, could we put individual education program in front of IEP in parentheses? Would someone like to make a motion to replace the existing policy with this alternate policy?
I will make that motion.
Mr. Davis,
All right, calling the roll, Mr. Howard,
yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Eichler,
Yes.
and Mr. DeMayo.
Yes.
All right.
Well, thank you to Mr. DeRosa for doing the Zoom call and to Ms. Pirro for getting out all the correct notices, and Dr. Byers for all the advice. So
You send a thank you to Carolyn Dugas too, because she did an awful lot with those Title IX policies.
thank you for that. So would someone like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I'm assuming there are no objections, so show of hands, beep of the car that we're good to go.
All right.